Welcome, Duke alumni and friends, to this session of the Duke Alumni Forever Learning Institute. I'm Jamal Michelle, Assistant Director of Communications here at the John Hope Franklin Humanities Institute, and I am thrilled to have you joining us today for our session on reclaiming narratives, human rights, human wrongs. This is the fourth and final session in our Why the Humanities Matter, the Sense of Social series. And for those who may not be familiar, at Duke, the FHI serves as a hub for humanities inquiry and interdisciplinary collaboration. And today's discussion is going to examine how humanities scholarship challenges systems of power and helps amplify marginalized voices. We'll, of course, have time for Q&A at the end, so please feel free to drop your questions in the chat as you think of them or when we start to take audience questions. You'll also be asked to complete a brief survey at the end of the session. And so today I'm here to moderate the program, and I'm privileged to be joined by Wesley Hogan, research professor at the John Hope Franklin Humanities Institute, Jocelyn Olcott, professor of history at the Trinity College of Arts and Sciences, and Adam Rosenblatt, director of the Duke Human Rights Center at the FHI and professor of the practice in international comparative studies. Wesley's work focuses on youth social movements, human rights, documentary studies, and oral history. Her most recent book, on the freedom side, traces young people organizing in the spirit of Ella Baker since 1960, and her current project centers the oral histories of reproductive health care providers in the post-Roe era. Jocelyn directs the International Research Network Revaluing Care in the Global Economy. Her scholarship focuses on feminism, care, and modern Mexico, and she's the author of Revolutionary Women in Post-Revolutionary Mexico, as well as International Women's Year, the greatest consciousness-raising event in history. She's currently working on projects about third world feminist networks and the Mexican activist and folk singer Concha Michelle. And Adam is an ethnographer, and his work explores human rights, ethics of care, and our ongoing relations with the dead. He's the author of Digging for the Disappeared and Cemetery Citizens, and his work also includes community-engaged research on African American burial grounds and the use of comics in teaching and scholarship. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I'd like to briefly turn the floor over to you, Wesley, if you could start to talk to us about your work in the humanities.
It's great to be with everybody today. Thanks so much for joining. So as Jamal mentioned, for most of my career, I have done oral histories with youth activists, and I got involved because I was really excited and confused as a young student, a college student, getting involved in the anti-apartheid movement in the 1980s. And so most of my work has centered there. But in June of 22, 2 days after the Supreme Court overturned the Roe versus Wade decision, a neighbor and friend of mine was running then the OBGYN residency program at Duke, Dr. Beverly Gray. And she called me, and she's this like very calm, cool, collected surgeon. And she was crying. And I've never seen that. And she told me about in a neighboring state, a friend of hers had attended a birth, was the doctor at that birth, and had um, a, baby was fine. The baby was in the warmer, and the young mom started to hemorrhage, not very uncommon for first-time mothers. And the OR administrator would not let her friend, another doctor, do the procedure that the young mom needed to stop the bleeding. Young women, there's almost, they have about 10 minutes before they bleed out when that happens. And the OR administrator had simply said, because of Dobbs, we don't know if we can do a DNC on this mom. And of course, it was not an abortion, it was a postpartum hemorrhage. And it was a very, very scary moment. And the doctor kind of took the patient and wheeled past the OR administrator and went into the operating room and treated the hemorrhage. The young mom has long-term health issues as a result. And my friend Bev said to me, so we need to get together. You need to get your butt over here. This is no longer a time where you can, continue the work that you're doing. This is an all hands on deck emergency. We need you to start collecting oral histories from providers. All of my friends who are OBGYNs around the South, we need to tell what's happening in the first few days after Dobbs. So, I was shocked. I did not have a background in women's health. I did not know much about pregnancy and birth. But for the last 4 years almost, we've been working with undergraduates and graduate students on a Basque Connections team And at this point, we've collected a little over 120 interviews with reproductive care providers across the country. We've mostly focused on people where states where there are abortion bans, but doctors in access states like Washington State, California, Illinois, Maryland, New York asked us to be part of the project too because their work was so dramatically changed in the first. It has been and continues to be dramatically changed after Dobbs. Um, our team is really unique, and I'm so grateful to Jamal and the team for bringing this group together. It's the first time that I've worked as a humanist with doctors and law school professors, so it really builds on Duke's strengths in those areas, combining with John Hope Franklin Humanities Institute. We're focused on providers, not patients. We have a website at this point, and our two doctors have done a podcast. And then we have, whoops, we have a little bit of time. I think I'm going to wait to play a little excerpts a little later on. But just to orient people, I was very new to this, so just going to give a general overview. About 61% of the people in the US who get abortion care are already parents. 49% of them live below the poverty line, and abortion care is about 13 times safer than even safe pregnancy. So those were all really important background pieces for me to understand when doing this work. And then a little later on, we'll talk some more, but just in case people need some orienting, I see that there's somebody here from Australia. So US law can be a little confusing from the outside. Roe was the 1973 decision that gave women the right to end a pregnancy during the first 2 trimesters, and Dobbs was the 2022 Supreme Court decision taking that right away. So we'll talk a little bit more about our findings later on. But at this point, I'm really grateful to be here with everybody, and I'll turn it over back to Jamal.
Thanks so much for that, Wesley, and for the work, the necessary work you're doing and research in reproductive health. I will move over to Jocelyn, if you can tell us a little bit about the work you do in the humanities.
Yeah, let me go ahead, and I have just a few quickie slides that and uh let's see. Um does that so can people see the slides now? And let me see if I can get, well, okay. I'm gonna hopefully I can see, I can't see you, but hopefully you can see me. So quickly, one of the hats that I wear is that I am the director of the Revaluing Care Lab, which is supported by the Franklin Humanities Institute. And I wanted to talk briefly today about what's now being considered care as a human right and why it matters that we're approaching that from a humanities or humanistic perspective in a field that's been mostly dominated by the social sciences. So in August of last year, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights offered an advisory opinion that the right to care is an autonomous right, and it based it in part on conventions within the OAS, but also on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and really expressing that as a human rights concern. I think one thing that's interesting here is that Latin America has really emerged as a region where a lot of innovative thinking, research, policymaking, and activism is happening around the question of care. And I'll explain that in a moment. But just to give some background about why this is interesting and why this is a humanities question, this is a field that conventionally has been thought of from the perspective of economics and social sciences. So starting in the 1930s with the introduction of GDP, and then in 1953, what's called the system of national accounts, which is the sort of international version of that. The idea is that what counts as an economy and what measures economic health is what is in a market, what is valued in a market. And so that provoked a lot of, as soon as these ideas were introduced, already in the 1930s and certainly in the 1950s, there was a really intense response, particularly by women, unsurprisingly, that conception of what counted as an economy, only what passes through a market, basically erased and completely devalued the vast amounts of work that women were doing in terms of food production and distribution, care for dependents, care for community networks that were really indispensable to human survival. In 19, oh, let's see if I can do this. Oh, there we go. In 1975, it launched the International Women's Year and then the UN Decade for Women, and including a lot of attention to Esther Bostrup's work on women and economic development. And there was a intensification of both knowledge production, research around questions of women and where they fit in to this idea of development. But still, all of that was in this social science frame of what we need to solve for is getting women into the labor market rather than recognizing the huge amounts of labor that women were already doing. And so we kind of, it at that point was still sticking to this women's, let's see, sorry. Oh, sorry. And I said, this is from the newspaper, this like immediate criticism of like, what women need is not actually more work. What women need is a recognition of this huge amount of work that's already being done. So there was this criticism of the development scheme really from the very beginning, particularly from the Global South. A relationship, a generation of activist intellectuals in the Global South, such as Krishna Ahuja Patel, but she's part of a whole cohort of mostly women who tried to use the UN system to leverage various human rights, such as what's called CEDAW, the Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, to offer what we can think of as an immanent critique of these ideas. So a critique from within their frameworks and logics to say, if this is what you're trying to solve for, this concept of human rights, you really need to reconceptualize the entire nature of what you consider an economy and its relationship to society. So these critiques fostered particularly in the West, a field that became known as feminist economics. I think probably the most familiar of these is a woman named Marilyn Waring, whose book Who Counted is often seen as starting feminist economics. I would argue that there's a lot of intellectuals in the Global South that started sooner, but she's really focused on how do we ascribe value to these unpaid labors for the sake of their visibility and recognition. And so again, it's sort of staying in that social science mode of sort of how do we think about this in terms of value. I think what's interesting is that even Waring very quickly walked back from that. The sense that if we stayed in that framework of thinking about value and efforts to price care, that we had sort of lost the whole battle essentially. And then so the humanistic push that comes in, particularly around questions of ethics and thinking around care as a public good, really pushed this to think outside of the realm of social sciences and numeracy and the kind of measuring of things, and thinking about what are the broader principles of ethics and values that we might bring to this question of care. Particularly in Latin America, there's been greater attention to what we would think of as care for the more than human. So care for ecological care, human and non-human relationships. The term in Latin America is often buen vivir, the living well, meaning a kind of stewardship for the non-human world around us. And then starting in 2017, there was a series of strikes that were considered feminist strike. They were labeled as feminist strikes, linking, and this connects to what Wesley was talking about, linking the questions of all of this social reproductive labor with questions around gender violence and reproductive justice. And so the two colors here, purple is usually the color for gender violence. The green bandana, which echoes human rights battles earlier in Argentina, was the icon for reproductive justice. And so this green and purple icons were kind of floating around, and you can see them, I think, in a lot of this. Poignantly, that Históricas one that you can see there on the left is actually from March of 2020. It's like the last thing that happened before we all went into lockdown. So a lot of activist intellectuals in Latin America continue to work within these systems of liberal internationalism to try to leverage them. The Inter-American Court of Human Rights, of course, as I mentioned at the outset, but also the Inter-American Commission on Women set up model legislations to create national care systems that would be kind of adapted throughout the region to think about the question of care within local contexts. And then I think an important thing to think about also is that the UN continued to be an important ally for this. The expert group of Beyond GDP is pushed to think about What are the non-GDP ways that we can think about this question of value? And then just last August, after the Inter-American Court, the what's called CEPAL, or the Economic Commission on Latin America, which is another UN body, convened its regional conference on women. To me, I think kind of poignantly, in the exact site where the International Women's Year Conference had taken place a half century earlier, and had sort of rejected or failed to take up these questions of care, decided that they were going to take on a paradigm shift of putting care-based society at the very center of policymaking. So I point to all of these to just highlight the fact that they emerged out of a shift from, or an expansion from, the social scientific paradigm to a more humanistic framework, and with particular emphasis on questions of human rights and of ethics, to put those at the core of the most quotidian, mundane efforts required for people on the planet to flourish. So, in other words, humanistic inquiry called into the question the idea of value, which we often think of as price, and attached it again to this idea about broader human values of what we consider most important in the world. So I will stop sharing there, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Jocelyn. And I'm looking forward to your insights on some of the questions that we get to later on, because to really assess that reduction is important, because it helps us contend with labor as a domestic product, right? And that is how your care is being valued, and that's dehumanizing in many different ways. But I'm looking forward to your thoughts. And finally, Adam, if you could talk to us about your relationship to the humanities.
Sure, I'm happy to be here to talk with you all and to be in conversation with my amazing colleagues. I am also going to share a few slides, so I've just got to get those open. And I want to talk to you all just for a couple minutes about the humanities, human rights, and the dead. So I've spent most of my scholarly career studying what the dead and their burial places mean to living people, and especially living people who are still actively searching for justice in the wake of injustice. So the humanities, for me, I maybe approach it from a somewhat different angle, in that what they do kind of most powerfully is they give us ways to connect to the full personhood and complexity of the dead. Not that the dead aren't still present in really interesting ways in non-humanities fields. Certainly there's the building up of knowledge formula we still use, in the sciences. But there's a claim that I think the humanities can make to bring us into dialogue with the full complexity of the dead, both as people who lived in a particular historical time and place, and as people whose ideas we're still grappling with. So the area where I engaged with this in my first book, Digging for the Disappeared, was in the boom in applying forensic science in the aftermath of genocide and massacres, so in the human rights context. And that's a boom that really started in 1980s Argentina in the wake of a regime that disappeared people and buried them anonymously in mass graves. And so the forensic anthropologists and other experts who kind of built this field of forensics in human rights saw the power of bringing science to questions of identity, really urgent questions of identity, especially identifying these bodies that had been buried, with an attempt to erase them, and documenting war crimes. But crucially, and here's where the humanities come in, science alone is never the only way we're going to understand something as complex as identity. So as this work started to unfold in multiple contexts, other logics of what it means to identify somebody were present in every place where forensic anthropologists work. So for example, whereas forensic anthropologists might be looking to use probabilities and multiple techniques to match a particular set of remains with a person's name and their story, there might be villagers in Guatemala who allow for a first round of identification in the traditional way, and then come around a second time and try to claim all of the bodies that have not been successfully identified in that first round of scientific work. And that's a way of saying we don't leave anybody behind. So people will claim as their own remains that are not actually from their family, as a sort of cultural logic of belonging. Identification in these what are sometimes called transitional justice contexts are also they're a part of a political bargain where when you accept an identification from the government, you're also in a way speaking to its legitimacy. And so there have been groups, including the Madres de Plaza de Mayo, the Mothers of the Disappeared in Argentina, who've actually tried to put a wrench in that process. They've refused exhumation and refused the scientific logic of identification as a way of insisting we want to see our children alive, even if that's a counterfactual, and as saying we don't agree to this political bargain. Another issue that comes up in this boom of forensic work are actually really the issues of metrics and value that Jolie just spoke about so powerfully. So there was a lot of pressure right around the same time as forensics and human rights was kind of a growth field starting in the 90s to establish metrics for human rights work, for other nonprofit work. There are parts of the process that can be measured traditionally and other parts that seem to keep pushing against the types of values that were on offer. So I won't read these full quotes just due to time, but the Berta Shubarov, this member of the Grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo, speaks in terms of when her son's remains were identified. She speaks about both what identification brings her in terms of knowledge and certainty and an ability to move into a new part of the grief process, but also of the reawakening of trauma and pain. So that's a very ambivalent thing to attach a metric to. My dear friend Robin Reinecke, who has spent a career trying to help identify the bodies of migrants who died trying to cross into the US through the Sonoran Desert, talks about the forms of destruction that are required as part of the forensic process. So here we see that forensic care and care for the dead of necessity winds up overlapping also with certain kinds of violence. I just want to briefly mention my more recent work in systemically neglected cemeteries and burial grounds, and perhaps most importantly here in Durham with Geer Cemetery, which is a historic African-American burial ground and a place where I'm on the board and I bring students and I also have written about it. So these are spaces where, what drew my attention to them is that you have, unlike the forensic experts who have this really specialized training, you have volunteers who come out on Saturdays and just pour labor into reclaiming these cemeteries and trying to pull weeds off of headstones, make them usable spaces and reinsert them into the historical narrative. But a bunch of people can agree that they want to reclaim a cemetery, but quickly find that what it means to do a reclamation actually means different things to different people. Is the goal to restore it as closely as possible to its original state when families were burying loved ones there? Or does the cemetery in some ways need to be reimagined because these dead are people who've been excluded from the historical narrative in many cases, from the understanding of place? Do you need to rethink what that cemetery is and how it welcomes people in to learn about it? There are also people thinking in our gentrifying and ever more dense cities about cemeteries as green space and what it might mean to rethink how they serve communities, for example, by bringing in kids to do citizen science or having edible fruit orchards. So the last thing I'll say before I pass the baton is that I've talked about all these tensions and frictions, and I think it's really easy in the moment we're all in politically to think of conflict, or I guess conflict is so debased and so ugly in so much of what we encounter. It's easy to think about conflict as a bad thing. Part of the humanistic approach that I take to the sites I engage with is at times celebrating conflict as part of what it means to live in a democracy. And I think probably the cemeteries I've worked in are the most powerful example of that, where people are disagreeing with each other, they are having different visions, but they're having that in places that they value in common, that connect them not only to other living people, but to the legacies of the dead. And they're actually transforming cemeteries into profoundly democratic spaces, I would argue. Thanks so much, and I will pass it along.
Thank you for that, Adam. And it's just an important reminder, too, that a lot of the work you're all doing is in conflict with erasure. You're actively excavating many of these many lost histories and forgotten histories so that we understand what it means to be human, what it means to have human rights. And that really does bring me to first to you, Wesley, and how your work brings together youth organizing, oral history, documentary practice, and in many ways it keeps social movements grounded in this lived experience. And so, what do you think the humanities can teach us about how movements for justice are remembered, carried forward, and definitely made legible for future generations?
Yeah, I think first of all, it was really exciting to see my colleagues' work. So I'm looking forward to the interaction. But on this question, they also might have interesting perspectives to share. For me, what I would take it a little broader than the humanities and say arts, particularly song, film, dance. These are ways that people pass their traditions forward and help remember, especially contested histories or histories that are just really difficult. We're all three of us dealing with really difficult, heavy topics. And one of my teachers was a veteran of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, Bernice Johnson Regan, and she was an ethnomusicologist and a leader of a music group. And she said that the spirituals were a cultural load thrown forward to the future to help people understand how they could continue to respond to oppression in different eras other than the ones they were created in. And I think some of the work that we are doing builds on those kinds of traditions, and also allows us, the documentary work now allows us to actually know what's happening. I think the reproductive care work, a lot of times there's so much shame and stigma around reproductive care in general, but then I think people understandably don't want to share publicly what when they go through something difficult reproductive care wise, and doctors are legally bound not to share it. And so what we've been trying to do is provide a way for the public to know what's happening sort of behind this veil of privacy and stigma and healthcare law, and show people what's happening in the wake of the DABS decision. And it's pretty devastating. So of the people that we've interviewed, every single one of them who practices in a banned state says that they cannot practice evidence-based medicine holistically within reproductive care. And that's just a finding that's important for the public to know now. So I love your question about how does this connect generations? How do we tell people, coming along now and in the future, where freedom movements have excelled, where they have been victorious, what strategies they've used that work, as well as what doesn't work. I think that's really important to keep alive through the humanities, through music, through film. But I also think it's really important sometimes just to let people know in our very distractible world what is actually happening in different parts of the world and in our own country.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Wesley. And it reminds me of how irrevocably bound, reproductive care and civil rights movements are, especially historically. And I think your work and what you mentioned dovetails quite nicely with your work, Jocelyn, and how your scholarship on feminism care and transnational political networks helps us think about justice in ways that are not just historical, but also global.
Yeah.
We seem to be stuck in this hegemonic where sort of American history is where we gather all our information about um, human rights in many ways. And I wonder for you, how does a humanities approach help us understand care, not just as some private value, but as something that's consistently shaped by power, policy, and a collective struggle?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's you put your finger on the central question, which is um, how is it even possible that this vast amount of time and labor and expertise and attention is just completely erased? And it's not just erased within, I think that there's a way you can point to sort of advanced capitalist neoliberal paradigms that are really kind of intensely focused on counting things through market mechanism. Like I think in the like purest form of neoliberalism, everything would be commodified, right? And so I would go out to work and I would pay somebody else to take care of my dependents, whatever. And that's the sort of system that would and so the critique of that has been there all along. I think part of why the Latin American case is so inspiring is that is a place where the critique of neoliberalism started as soon as neoliberalism started, right? That was the kind of power dynamics that you're pointing to around that. I think the other thing that's really important, there's one of the women, in addition to the Concha Michel project, I'm doing this sort of cohort study of these activist intellectuals who came of age as the idea of a formal measured economy was coming into place. And one of them is this Senegalese sociologist named Marie-Angelique Savané, and she's described as a guerrilla warrior within the social sciences because she's constantly saying, like, this thing that you're calling an economy, it has nothing to do with the actual economic activity that's happening here. And she's saying this not to development people or to capital, like to the socialist leaders of these post-colonial countries. So it's not just a question of capitalism, it's a question of what sorts of labor were being ignored. And I think what's interesting, I teach about a lot of this stuff. I think a lot of young people, by young people, I mean college age people these days, are really struggling to think about what it's going to look like for them to try to have a family, or what it's going to look like for them to try to exist in a world where things are more sustainable in social and ecological terms. And for them, I think they really want to push this question forward, and they've been pretty inspired by some of the ideas that are coming from other places in the world, like ways we can just sort of open up this question and think about radically new ways that you might imagine it. So I think that the kind of transnational flows have been really important, both on a kind of formal way and in this more organic way they're tending to happen. It's been, at least for me, very, very exciting.
And it's also like recontextualized the conversation we're having about the global South, who often pays the price for a lot
Yes.
of what makes our economy flourish, whatever this means. We did have a request for you, Jocelyn, in the chat that if you were able to share the slide regarding inequity in percentages that women are represented in.
I think you're probably thinking of Wesley's, right? Or
So
post a
I,
slide
I
around
don't know if it was
inequity.
you or Wesley that had the slide that was showing inequality in percentages that are women or that had women represented. Either way, if any of you have that or find that, we could um,
Um,
post it at the end. But I just wanted to put that out there. Someone in the audience had asked.
yeah.
But to your point, Jocelyn, we are hearing more conversations about the global South, and we're hearing more conversations about the death and destruction that permeates the global South. And more people are recognizing that in ways that, quite frankly, we haven't in the last several years. And in thinking about human rights, especially the rights of the dead and the deceased, Adam, your work specifically on human rights burial grounds and the ethics of care, it asks us to think more seriously about memory and dignity and our obligations, not just to the living, but to the dead. And I wonder for you what a humanities-centered focus or inquiry would make possible when we're trying to respond ethically to histories of violence, loss, genocide, and neglect that continue to unfold around us.
Yeah, thanks, Jamal. And when I think about making ethical inquiry possible, in a lot of ways, I think about teaching and what we do with our students more at this point than I do about my sort of solo research. So I'm gonna, if you guys will indulge me, I'm gonna share one more slide. Um, so these are this is work from a chosen ancestor project that my students do over the course of the semester in my class, Death, Burial, and Justice in the Americas. And what you're seeing here is the kind of colorful and creative projects they produce at the end. But this project actually starts out with very real training in tough humanities research methods. So folks that I know from my cemetery work, public historians, genealogists, come in and train the students to do research and find everything they can in the archives about an ancestor they have chosen, which the chosen part is important. It may or may not be a biological relative. And so what you're seeing here are on the left, a proposed new square on the national AIDS quilt that's been in existence since the 80s for a family friend who the student felt wasn't commemorated properly. An altar made at home to a chosen ancestor, and a poem by a student. And I just, as I'm actually reading a new batch of these at the end of the semester, I think about the almost pathologically future-oriented environment that our students live in, the anxiety to achieve at the same time as others have mentioned. The most of the discourse about the future is really quite depressing. And this project allows them instead to look backwards and to find belonging and connection backwards. And so it really, for me, it sums up that kind of engagement with the past that I mentioned earlier. But what they often reflect on at the end is how much they wish they could still know that they can't, right? How much research is always fragmentary and repair or connection is always partial. And yet, I think what I can offer them above all that feels to me very humanities is this sense both of inescapable loss and an inability to recuperate everything they might want to, and yet an ever stronger hunger to keep connecting and to keep trying. And so I have to share the last few lines of this poem that Yian Dong wrote about her great-grandfather who asked to have his ashes scattered at sea, but the family decided to go against his wishes and bury him. And so she's been investigating that ethical complexity of betraying the wishes, her family betraying the wishes of her great-grandfather. And she writes, "The cemetery, the album, these poems, we keep you the only way we know, with our stubborn, unnecessary love."
I think that's incredibly appropriate too, considering the work that you all do as archivists. You know, you exhume stories of the past and you preserve and you take great care. And it's a very tender practice. And it makes me think about the work of the humanities and the scholarship that goes into it. And I have like a question I'd rather pose to the group of you now in thinking about justice and scholarship, which often seem to be treated as mutually exclusive, but could very well be catalysts for the other. What was there a text or an encounter or something you engaged with in the archive or just an experience you've had that essentially changed how you understood the relationship between scholarship and justice?
I mean, I guess I'll start. I think the thing that has been really, um, I think a lot of scholars uh, torture ourselves a bit about how relevant our work will be, and that's always that's always a question. These women that I study, what's really compelling to me about them is they never let go of the idea that producing new knowledge that questioned the common sense, like they were always pushing at and probing the assumptions behind it. In this case, behind like what constitutes value and what constitutes productive labor, and like just constantly pushing at that. And they understood that it was not, the arc of justice is really super, super long, even if it's going to bend toward justice. And so I think that they understood that they were in it for the long game of constantly producing new questions and knowledge for a kind of next generation. Um, it, I think it is a way of thinking about knowledge production that is different from here is a task at hand that I'm going to solve and check off the list. And it's one that is much more, the temporality of it is much more about a kind of longer term conception. And that to me has been, it's both terrifying because it's really daunting, but it is inspiring to see these intellectuals thinking in that way, and that the way that over the course of generations that sort of moved this conversation forward in such important, really quite transformative ways. So I guess it's like helped me think about, I'm just going to be like put in my little piece of the of the whole thing. Anyway, just that.
I love that question. And just building on Jolie's statement, I mean, I feel like who we are accountable to is a really important question to ask when looking at the interaction between scholarship and justice. So when we're trained as very young graduate students, oftentimes in the US at least, we're taught to come in with a objective lens, as if we're not embodied, as if we don't have families and ancestors of our own, and perspectives that we bring. And I found very early in my work interviewing youth civil rights activists that was not possible. They had a huge stake in sharing what they'd been through, and they weren't going to tell it to people who they thought were going to abuse it. And objectivity was abusive. And so, or the way objectivity was being expressed in the 1990s when I was interviewing them was abusive. And so we found, my scholar friends and I who were interviewing them found that unless we were accountable to those activists, we could not get the full story of how they had carried out their work. They simply didn't trust us enough to share it. So the record was incomplete. We had combed through all the archives. We had looked at all the public facing information, but they weren't going to share their stories with us unless we could express that this work was important to us individually and personally and why. And I think that that is really distinct from my colleagues in medicine that I'm working with now, who by and large still feel like objectivity is achievable. And so we have debates all the time, especially as we look at the impact of the abortion care work. The women who are the most impacted by the abortion bans are those who are Black and Native and all women who are low wealth. So those are the people who are most at risk of dying from a pregnancy. And so it's really daunting to come into that field and try to convince doctors who've been trained under this lens of objectivity for very real reasons, right? Scientific reasons, that we can treat everyone the same, because we can't. They're not facing the same healthcare realities. And so we're very much deep in the middle of that now. And I would just encourage us to open that question up a bit, because I think it's a really good challenge.
Yeah, I would just add, I mean, my colleagues have both just spoken so beautifully to the kind of how we're haunted sometimes by wanting our scholarship to be relevant, and also about issues of accountability. I think sometimes, I guess I'll just say personally, I've found that with my newer work on cemeteries, some of the pressure on the scholarship itself, and some of maybe attaching kinds of importance to it that it can't bear, have eased up a lot by being able to see, my book or the articles I write as a tiny part of a much larger world that I'm now inhabiting. And that's been a huge change from my first book for a number of reasons, partly just being in one, like I was an academic nomad for a while. Being in one place with a secure job for 8 years will do a lot in terms of your ability to be a different kind of scholar. And so, having this thing where, yes, there are really high stakes, important ethical choices I make in my scholarship, but also I put down my laptop and I go to a Friends of Gear Cemetery board meeting, and I'm not in charge. I'm there in many ways to follow the agenda established by Deborah Taylor Gonzalez Garcia, the president of the organization, and other leaders there. And then sometimes I'm bringing those people as experts into my classroom, and I'm sort of sitting down and shutting up while they take over the class. But sometimes, we're coming to them in their spaces. So I also think, to the extent that your scholarship can be part of a much larger constellation, where it's being fed by and feeding that world, I've found that helps orient me a lot better towards these ethical questions.
Yeah, and your responses are profoundly important, and remind me why I appreciate the humanities so much, because that the length of the moral arc might be difficult to discern, but humanities researchers still take on the task of what some might consider absurd in answering these global challenging questions. What makes us human, and why do we do what we do, and who deserves rights, and how are those rights being distributed? And I'd actually like to take this time to move over to audience questions. So as we wait for folks to drop any questions they have in the chat, I'll leave you all with one more question, and that's really, when does humanities work feel the most consequential to you?
I keep jumping in first, but I'll just, I mean, I think to me, I've been thinking about this question about how we ascribe value to all of this labor for decades now. So I'm not going to say like too long, right? And I think and I think I've often thought about it as many scholars have in deeply social scientific ways. And I think that it's been really transformative to me to not just realize myself, but to have kind of foisted upon me by others how much a humanistic perspective transforms the way we think about these central questions. And it's made visible to me a set of like my own common sense, the set of assumptions that I had in my own head about the way I was approaching these questions that I just had stopped noticing. And it's been humbling to have to reckon with that, but incredibly important for trying to think about what to me feels like a critical, urgent question in a much more thoroughgoing and far-reaching way than you can do within the kind of more narrow confine. I mean, social science by design needs to be able to like hold certain things constant and put things in a box. That's how it does its work. I think all of that is super important, but I think to kind of contain these questions into those boxes, we kind of lost the thread, we lost the most urgent parts of the question. And I have to say, I mean, I've learned this from other scholars and other things. I maybe learn it most kind of pressingly from my students. Because for them, this is a question we cannot let go of. And I think that they are, for to them, the idea that we're going to stay within those boxes is really impossible. And so that I think the students have every year pushed me to continue to kind of interrogate my thinking. That's been and pushed, I think, in a more humanistic direction, which is not what we maybe would expect from, like, I think we have this idea of where undergraduate heads are, and they've pushed me, I think, in good ways.
Jamal, do you want me to answer some questions in the chat, or do you want me to answer that?
I was just going to grab one of them just now that was from earlier. That was actually at the top of our conversation. And so, depending on how much time we have, we can answer this one for days. But one audience member asks, what is the philosophical or logical basis for the belief that humans have or should have rights? How do we ultimately know that human rights exist?
Adam, I'm happy to answer that, but as the head of the Human Rights Center, I feel like that's really a you question.
I was so worried somebody would point out as a director of the Human Rights Center because
Well,
it's such a it's a conversation really it's a question that's been debated since before there was the modern human rights framework, and that in many ways, unlike many other things, where the folks who drafted the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in so many ways, it's just amazing everything they thought of and what a holistic, integrative document they created. But specifically on this question of sort of where do human rights come from, there was a lot of stuff they punted, including, I see in the chat a question about where does religion fit in. There was a big debate over whether you could have an account of human rights that didn't name a creator or name God. And the decision was to leave it out, but without any kind of argument or resolution, just to kind of kick that ball down the road. So, I guess in my role in the Human Rights Center and as an educator, again, this will sound like a cop-out, but I'm much more interested often in bringing new people into the conversation than in my own answer. I do tend, as humanistic as I might be, I tend to have a lot of sympathy for the pragmatist argument that was once made by the philosopher Richard Rorty, that sort of, if human rights help us get somewhere, that looks better for people than where we were before, then human rights become in a way self-justifying, regardless of your theory. But I also just want to, the last thing I want to put out there and this speaks to your earlier question, Jamal, about where we find the work of the humanities most compelling. It seems to me that we need both to honor what's in the human rights tradition that is useful, but as Jocelyn said earlier about some of the thought that's emerging from Latin America, we cannot have the dominant ethical framework for our planetary well-being, put human at its center and elevate it above everyone else. And the ironic thing here to me is that it is precisely the tools, the outside of the box thinking that gets labeled humanities, with human, right, highlighted in that term, that actually are where people are thinking, I think, most critically and most generatively about the ethical frameworks beyond the human that are literally the only way that we're going to survive together on this planet.
Thanks so much, Adam. I'm really excited about thinking that way with you. I would add that coming out of the Second World War is a really important turning point. It isn't the origin of human rights thinking, but the question that was asked at the top of the chat around, where does human rights thinking come from? I think most of the work that I do comes out of these sort of Hiroshima and the death camps, the Nazi death camps, right? So people thinking about how can we make sure that these episodes in human history are never repeated. And so the framework, the international framework, comes in the immediate moments after that. In 1948, the UN embraces the Declaration for Human Rights. And one of the pieces the question about religion for me is really exciting and also challenging. So in the civil rights movement, religion is an absolutely central component, both in the religious institutions of Black Americans are at the absolute center of powering the civil rights movement, and helping people think beyond the current moment to what kind of world people want to live in. And in the current work that I do around abortion care, I think it's very, very hard for people. There's many religious people that will speak up. The providers that we interview will say, people are constantly telling me I'm going to hell for the work that I do, but this is how I think about my Christianity as I provide this care for women. There is a series of lawsuits happening right now for non-Christians who are saying, my First Amendment rights are being voided by the fact that a very distinct form of Christian interpretation is what's driving the most recent Supreme Court decision restricting the right to abortion care. So I think there's a lot of ways that religion serves as a liberating force, a force for freedom and equality, and treating everybody the same way, especially people who are one down, who have been oppressed in one or multiple ways. And then we also see ways that religion has been used as a cudgel or a weapon to keep people down and to create hierarchies. So I would love, thoughts from my colleagues or from people who are attending today, to hear some of their perspectives on the role of religion and human rights.
The one thing that I would add on the religion question, I mean, I think the thing that's really animated care studies is thinking about the importance of interdependence and interrelationality. And so there are aspects of the human rights discourse that are kind of individualized, that are about individual rights, and the care study, the whole field is about an idea of kind of a collective rights, but also in the Latin American context, and I think that Adam was gesturing toward this earlier, the concept of care has really been animated by a particular, not just one form, but various forms of spirituality that grow out of a strong influence of indigenous cultures and religious practices. And so I think that related to the idea of buen vivir is this idea of the Pachamama, the idea of kind of thinking about the whole. I mean, as Adam, I think, said really powerfully, that it's not a human centered, that we're simply here as part of a larger system of creatures that are kind of tending to this earth that we're on. And thinking about it not as a source of resource extraction, but a thing that we're supposed to be caretaking. And I think that form of spirituality has been really powerful. I think the other part of it is that there's parts of Latin America that are deeply, deeply Catholic, and the Catholic Church has has a mixed record on a lot of these things, but is, among other things, puts a lot of caretaking at its center, a kind of social justice practice at its center. And so I think those two things have come together in a lot of ways.
Thank you all for your responses. We're getting close to time, but I wanted to get one last audience question in. And so this audience member says, thank you all for the presentations. They're important. However, I have a problem with how our government espouses human rights. Sorry, the chat is moving. However, I have a problem with how our government espouses human rights, but funds inhumane wars. Example, we fund collateral damage of 60 to 70,000 deaths in Gaza. Why is it so wrong to politically talk openly about human rights? And I think politically is what's carrying a lot of the weight here.
Like I'll just say this quickly, Adam, because it's 3:58. So you have the last word. But the piece that is always so clear from working with people at the base of society is that central governments need to have a lot of power to stay in existence. And human rights are oftentimes focused on the people who are the least of these, right? The people who have been really suffering at the bottom of society's ladders. And so I think they're always in conflict, human rights and central governments, and will stay so. And part of what I see my job is to make sure that people know and hear loudly the voices of people who are experiencing what life is like on the ground.
Yeah, just picking up on what you were just saying, Wesley, I think so we are talking about terrible acts of violence in Gaza, in Iran, in Lebanon, in the Caribbean, that all are coming at us like a fire hose. And with an administration that we should note, the person who asked that question, I think maybe has even more faith than I do that we are under an administration that even espouses human rights. I mean, we've withdrawn from periodic review of our human rights record. This administration has, to me, been very explicit that human rights don't merit any concern. But the language Wesley just used also reminded me, there's the everyday, the human rights framework is meant to be an integrative framework that points to the lack of shelter, the lack of healthcare, which is so central to Wesley's work, that points to structural injustice and poverty as being not only as persistent an injustice as direct violence, but the connection between them. And so our rights discourse in this country has been impoverished in some ways by US exceptionalism, but it's also been impoverished by this notion that you can be a rights forward society just by sort of talking about fair trials and elections and basically ignoring much of what's meant to be part of the fabric of human rights. So I mourn the ways in which we're at a moment of both extreme direct violence and of deepening structural violence. But to not leave on that note, I'll just say, the work that everyone's talked about today, and also the contact with our students and their brilliance, keep me going through that.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And I think your responses speak to these untenable positions fall squarely at the feet of the hegemonic powers that are like perpetuating this violence. And so to call that into question is to completely compromise their position and to completely expose like these global injustices. And I think everything that you've discussed today, all three of you, has been supremely useful in understanding the relationship between the humanities and human rights. And so I really, really just want to thank you, Wesley, Jocelyn, and Adam for such a great session, and to our audience for joining us.